Well, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen Town from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thanks. So, like Erica said, my name is Kristen Town. I am the Lake Erie Aquatic Invasive Species Early Detection Program Coordinator. This talk today is not too heavily non-native species or invasive species focused. This is going to be mainly about a collaborative general fish community survey that we did in 2023 in collaboration with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. So if you were present at the fishery workshop from last year, if you remember, Andrew Briggs from Michigan DNR did a fairly similar presentation about our collaboration in Lake St. Clair. We did both a small fish nearshore survey using pike nets and then an offshore survey using gill nets. So this, I can get that, there we go. So this is a continuation of that collaborative effort. So the collaboration was really initiated between Michigan DNR and Ontario Ministry back in 2018. They just did a general program review, realized that as a whole, they could be more efficient, get better spatial coverage if they work together. In 2021, our program joined, that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Early Detection and Monitoring Program. We fish in the Huron-Erie corridor every single year. We do a lot of effort out there. So we figured we could help the collaborative effort as it was, and then they could help us get some more effort in as we're out there surveying for new invasive species. And then this past year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Native Species Program joined into the collaboration as well. So they played a big role in our 2023 efforts in the Detroit River. So at this point, we are really on a rotation of fishery assessments in the Huron-Erie corridor in those shared waters between the U.S. and Canada. So in 2021, we did that Lake St. Clair nearshore small fish community survey with pike netting. In 2022, we did an offshore fish community survey of Lake St. Clair with gill nets. 2023, we did the Detroit River Connecting Channel assessment. And then 24, we will do a similar connecting channel assessment in St. Clair River, and then also go back to that offshore gill netting survey in Lake St. Clair. So a little background on the Detroit River. I'm sure this is known information for many of you, but for those that aren't so familiar with the Detroit River, it forms the last 44 kilometers of the Huron-Erie corridor, starting up in Sarnia, and then working its way down to the mouth of the Detroit River. Water residence time in the Detroit River is super short. It takes only about 19 hours to go from Lake St. Clair all the way down to Lake Erie. The Detroit River really has a wide variety of habitats. So although it does have a lot of hardened shoreline, particularly as you get closer to Detroit in that area, as you get further downstream, there is still some hardened shoreline, but there's also a lot of acreage of natural fish and wildlife habitat. So it has multiple variable flow areas. It's got variable depths. It's got rocky shoreline. It's got natural soft shorelines. So because it's so variable, it can be a little bit logistically difficult to sample. It means we have to use a lot of different gears that are really designed to sample that specific habitat type. And just its general size, it takes quite a bit of effort to really cover all of those habitats well and all of that spatial area really well. Simply the fact of it acting as the US-Canadian border also adds a level of logistical difficulty in sampling it when we're talking about going across the border and maybe bringing things back to the other side if we want to take structures for aging or anything like that. Bringing things across the border, we have to deal with passports, we have to deal with permits, both in the US and in Canada. So this collaboration with US and Canadian agencies really helps to alleviate some of those logistic difficulties. So for the Detroit River survey in 2023, we sampled from really right at the end of July through late September. We did a total of 115 sites. The goal was to do 150. The goal was to do 50 electrofishing, 50 with bottom trawl, and 50 with gill nets. Just because of how difficult Detroit River is to sample with some of those pelagic offshore deeper gears. We only managed to get in 34 and 31 of those offshore gear sites. But we designed it in a way that even if we didn't get the full 50, we would still get a good amount of data that we would need. So it's not the end of the world to not hit that 50. But we did get all 50 electrofishing sites in, so there is a ton of data that we have from that. Those electrofishing sites are all along the shoreline, so that is getting some of those shoreline species, those shallower species. And then the bottom trawls and gill nets are offshore. They're getting more of those benthic species, so fish that are along the deeper bottom habitat. And then the gill nets were our passive gears, so those gears fished overnight, and those were gears that were really good at catching those fish that are coming out and moving at night. For a very brief overview of the catch summary, in total, we did capture 60 different species and just about 7,800 fish. Most common fish were yellow perch, blunt-nosed minnow, and mimic shiners. And those mostly came out of electrofishing just because that is a gear type that you happen to catch a lot of individuals in, and we had the most sites done with electrofishing. Our least common species, we had a number that we only caught one time. Black bullhead, black crappie, black chin shiner, these are all some of our more rare species. So for instance, up here, that is a mottled sculpin. That is one species that we only caught once. Burbot here is another one we only caught once. And then here it's two kinds of darters. On top, that is looks like a Johnny darter or a triple darter maybe. And then the bottom here is a least darter. Those are very, very rare darters in the system and very small and a little bit more difficult to capture. And then also popular species we had young of year muskie and young of year northern pike. This guy actually, if I remember right, this guy had a small turtle in his belly that we could feel pretty easily. And then over there on the right, that is a young of year smallmouth bass and largemouth bass. We also caught some threatened and endangered species. On top there, that is an eastern sand darter. That is a species that we have never captured in our program, so we were really excited to see that. It is an at-risk species both in Ontario waters and in Michigan waters. We got that one electrofishing towards the mouth of the Detroit River. And then also electrofishing towards the mouth of the Detroit River, we got a channel darter. So that is also a species that is fairly rare. That one has been impacted by the round goby invasion. So it's really exciting to see the two of those come up in the survey as well. Breaking it down by gear type, like I said, electrofishing does catch the most species and it catches the most fish. It's just a very efficient gear type on its own. And when you're sampling that near shore area, that's typically where we're seeing a lot of those fish. The most popular species in all three gears was yellow perch. Rock bass was a very popular species in both bottom trawl and in gill nets. Gizzard shad did make an appearance in quite a few gill nets. That is, again, an offshore species. And then blunt-nosed minnow and mimic shiner are both very common nearshore species that we picked up in a lot of those electrofishing runs. Looking at where in the river we got a lot of those species in the bottom trawls, generally it's a little bit messy. None of this there was no significant spatial pattern that I found in any of this. But just very generally, it looked like we were getting fairly few species in the upper section of the river. This section is really where it gets to be a very hardened shoreline. We did not get many sites sampled in there because of it being that navigation channel, a really difficult area just to sample in general. And then as we got further downriver, that is the section where we were picking up more species in each of those sites. Generally the same thing for gill nets. We did have higher species richnesses up around that Belle Isle area. But again, we really can't set overnight gear, especially in those areas because of the navigation issues. It just kind of expands the difficulty in setting in those areas because now that gear is out there overnight and possibly causing issues for the freighters or just other boaters that are out there that don't see that gear in the water. We were seeing those same high species richness areas in the downriver sections as well, but again, there's really no significant spatial pattern to where they were getting a lot of species in gillnuts. Last but not least, electrofishing. Because this gear is so flexible, we were able to sample the entire length of the river. Again, no real spatial pattern to it, but just generally it looks like there might be a very slight increase in some of the species richness of some of the sites further downstream than generally we saw up around Belle Isle. We also took some information about what the shoreline looked like. So I threw this together to see if there was any influence on what the shoreline was to how many species we were capturing in our electrofishing runs, and also how many fish we were capturing in our electrofishing runs. The sandy beach down here, I wouldn't even look at that one. I just threw it on there because it did exist. We did fish a sandy beach, but we only got one of them. So that is kind of skewed down a little bit. But of these other four, these first three are a harder shoreline, and then this vegetated bank is a more softer shoreline. So perhaps we might see some of those, or some more species or more fish at some of those more natural shorelines. I know in Lake St. Clair, in the small fish near shore survey, we essentially did see that. We saw more species and more fish along those natural shorelines than we saw among within the hardened shoreline. At least for this study and this gear, we did not see the same pattern. So regardless of what these shoreline looked like, we were getting a pretty consistent number of species and then a pretty consistent number of fish in each of those runs. That could be partly due to just the fact that this is an electrofishing run. So the run itself is a whole 250 meters long. So within those 250 meters, you could be hitting multiple types of that shoreline. So yes, most of it could have been a seawall, but there very well could have been some vegetation within that. There could have been some of the more rocky areas that could have had different species, things like that. So that could be why we didn't see that same pattern in this data as we did in the Lake St. Clair stuff. Another thing I wanted to look at was to see if the fish community that we captured in each of those years was different. So this on the right is what's called an NMDS plot. It's basically looking at or trying to see if the community that's represented in each gear type is similar or if it's different. And this is basically showing that they were different. So each of these here represents, in this case, they represent sites. And then the circle represents the standard error of those sites. So if these were overlapping, that would be an indication that they were sampling the same fish community. So the fact that they are distinct basically means they were sampling different fish communities. They may have been capturing some of the same species. So if you remember, yellow perch was commonly found in all three gear types, but potentially it was found more in some gears than others, so more associated with some gears than others. So after I found that there was a difference in the communities that we detected in each gear, I wanted to know what those fish were. What fish were we getting most or significantly more in electrofishing versus gill nets versus bottom trawls. This is basically what I found. We did have a lot of species that were associated with certain gears. And that basically gives us an indication that they're associated with that gear, but they're also associated with the habitat that that gear is fishing in. Bottom trawls and gill nets did share yellow perch as a species that was significantly associated with it. That was kind of surprising because I was out on that electrofishing boat and we caught a lot of yellow perch. But that just means they were more associated. They were caught more frequently, or the catch rate was higher in those bottom trawls and gill nets than they were in electrofishing. There were a lot of species that were associated with electrofishing, all of those species we know are living in that near shore habitat that the bottom trawls and gill nets really aren't sampling. And a lot of these species that are more associated with gill nets and bottom trawls are those more offshore species. So I am on the non-native species team, so I had to talk about non-native species, of course. We did find 10 different non-native species in this survey, a total of about 400 fish. The most common invasive species we found were common carp, round goby, and alewife. That wasn't totally surprising. Common carp and round goby have been here in pretty high numbers for quite a while. Alewife was a little bit surprising. We typically don't see quite that many alewife in a given year. And then looking at some other agencies, alewife had a very big year in 2023. So this is potentially not something we're going to see in another 5 years, but it's interesting to see that there was somewhat of a boom in that alewife population, at least in the Lake Erie Basin this year. The least common non-native species we found were Atlantic salmon, like you see over here, ghost shiner right here, and then smallmouth buffalo down on the bottom right. And this up here is a common carp. That is just a morph of common carp that's commonly known as a mirror carp. So if you hear the term mirror carp, it's just a certain scaled variety of common carp. So general conclusions from this survey, the 2024 Detroit River or 2023 Detroit River survey, sorry, that's a typo there. The 2023 assessment is really going to serve as a baseline for future surveys. So from this information, we'll be able to use for future surveys to compare to. We'll be able to look for changes in different aspects of different populations, whether it be length, whether it be the age structure, whether it be just the general population size, species, presence, absence, things like that. So this collaboration, we are planning on continuing it into the future. I think it was a really, really great year one of this survey. We learned a few things, learned how to tweak a few things for the future. And we are excited to continue it in future years. So for this year, we are going to go back to Lake St. Clair and do another gillnet offshore fishery assessment. There are 30 sites that are planned in U.S. waters. Us and Michigan DNR are going to split those in half. So they will do 15 and we will do 15. And then Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry will do those 45 sites in Canadian waters. And then in the St. Clair River, we are going to do an assessment that is extremely similar to the Detroit River assessment we did in 2023. So it's going to be a goal of 50 bottom trawl sites, 50 electrofishing sites, and 50 gillnet sites. And it'll take place around that same time as the Detroit River assessment did. And that was all I had. I can take this was another non-native species that we found in the Detroit River during this assessment. One final plug for the invasive species program. If you happen to be out on the water and you catch something that you don't know what it is, you think it might be non-native or new or something different, feel free to shoot me an email with a picture of it. Just one good side view of it will be, for most fish, enough that we can get a good ID for you and let you know if it's something that we need to be worried about. Does anybody have questions?
I noticed one of the slides, I could have seen it wrong, is that there was virtually no fish captured in the Trenton Channel at all.
So the Trenton Channel, that is an area that's a little more difficult to sample. So we did we did fish there with electrofishing and get a good number of species there. But just with those other gears, it's not an area that is very easy to sample with some of those gears.
And then the Scott Middle Ground there on the north side of Bella.
Yeah, that was, so you're talking this, like this area over
Right.
on the mainland?
Just above the bridge to Bella.
Oh, just above the bridge to Bella. Yeah. I haven't really looked into like why or what factors may have influenced that. But yeah, I was a little confused too why that area seemed to have generally low species richness in some of those gear types. I wasn't overall surprised to see the lower part of the river had good species richness, but yeah, that upper part, I think I expected to be a little bit more species rich.
It was a random design.
Yeah.
So just,
We didn't get to pick where we fished really, it was
I
all,
just happen to know it's
It's
on
all
all the
random.
places. I'm pretty familiar with most of them.
yeah.
I just happen to see it.
Mhm.
have you found any smelt?
We do find some rainbow smelts. It's fairly rare to find rainbow smelt in the waters that we fish. We'll typically pick up a few a year, and more often than not, they'll be in that bottom trawl or in that gill net. Their teeth get caught up in some of those nets. We don't find them in electrofishing too often.
No, you said rainbow smelt. Is that the kind that used the beach in the spring?
Mhm.
And they get buckets of them?
Mhm.
But did you get the, but you didn't do, your samples didn't do any good for them. We didn't find any in the Detroit River, but are you gonna do Lake Erie?
So in our program, we do sample for non-native species in Lake Erie. We do sampling at pretty much the entire shoreline over to the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. At least for this collaborative fishery assessment, at the moment, we aren't planning on doing any Lake Erie work. This is mainly focused on the Huron-Erie corridor, where we have some of those very close shared waters with Canada.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So like depending on the time of the year, like in gear type, you can really catch a lot of rainbow smelt. Like I think in 2013, we set fight nets in the fall in the Detroit River, caught thousands of rainbow smelt, likely drifting downstream from Lake Huron. So it's just one of those things where it's kind of like that species matching up with the season and gear type that's being used.
That's good. That's
Yeah.
a good idea, if you connect with the season.
Mhm.
And we're gonna do that again this fall as well, because it was 10 years ago already. Last event.
Okay, thank you.
what is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doing when they capture non-native species of fish in these surveys?
Do you mean any non-native or like a new fish?
Either, like non-native and invasive?
So a little bit, I mean, it a little bit depends on the species. So round goby is a very, very good sturgeon bait. So we keep all of the round goby we catch for Justin and the sturgeon program to use on their set lines. If we catch, it a little bit runs into issues with where we are and what we can do at the time. So if it's our crew and we're in Canadian waters and we catch, there could be runs where we catch 100 common carp. We can't bring 100 common carp over the border to the US because of legal issues. So for those ones, we humanely euthanize them and then save them. If we were to catch a new species, that triggers a whole new detection protocol. So that species definitely does not get released. It gets positively ID'd and then sent up the food chain, if you will, to our regional office, and then they make a formal new detection report to the state managers. And then at that point, the state managers decide what kind of follow-up actions there are. So that'll depend on what the species is, how high risk it is, and things like that.
Okay.
So Asian carp is kind of a catch-all phrase.
Okay.
So there are 4 species of those, grass carp, black carp, silver carp, and big head carp. Grass carp are present in the Lake Erie Basin. There are a number of what are called strike teams that are tasked to both learn about their population and then just to physically remove as many of those fish as possible. There have been a few grass carp captures in Michigan waters. I think up to, there have been a couple even caught in Tittabawassee in the Lake Huron Basin. But the vast majority of them are in the West Basin of Lake Erie for grass carp. Black carp have never been caught in the Lake Erie or the Fort Basin. Big head carp have been very infrequently caught in Lake Erie. I believe Sandusky River, Sandusky Bay, there was one caught back in, I think, the year 2000, maybe one earlier than that. But we have no indication that they have any kind of population there. There are constant environmental DNA surveys that are out there looking for big-headed silver carp that are always coming up with zeros. There have never been any other of those individuals caught. So the only of those 4 species that we know are in the Lake Erie Basin is grass carp, and there are, I think, 11 different strike teams out there to address that problem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If the agencies that have discovered the grass carp, do they understand like how they would into like your basin?
The most likely pathway that they got in was through pond statements. So Ohio allows the stopping of triploid grass carp. Triploid grass carp are unable to reproduce. But there are diploid grass carp that have been found in Lake Erie tributaries.